Tim's second question is, what does the Bible actually say about drinking wine? Is teetotalism a biblical concept? Proverbs 23:31 is an often cited verse for abstinence from alcohol. Most concede drunkenness is a sin, but if drinking is permitted in moderation, how do you define drunkenness? What did ancient writers have to say on this matter? If moderate drinking is allowed, then what would the Bible say about the moderate use of cannabis or other substances?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Bible doesn't condemn the consumption of alcohol. It doesn't express as a command, teetotalism. The consumption of alcohol, in moderate amounts is allowed. Honestly, there's really no way to do justice to this topic in a Q&A. It's actually quite a large topic. You get into fermentation techniques. Basically, because of our technology, the alcohol we produce is much stronger than in biblical days. And most of what we would, have as alcohol would fall under the, quote, strong drink warning, which is different than wine in wisdom texts. And this, even in the modern world, we have this technological issue. In the Reconstruction era, in the late 19th century, one of the reasons why there was this big prohibition movement in the Reconstruction era on into the Progressive era was because the technology changed. The alcohol got stronger, a lot stronger, and so it led to all sorts of social problems, hence the big emphasis on prohibition. So we can actually go back in our own really immediate history and see how this, would have mattered. It's really going to matter when we compare what we have now back to the ancient world. I mean, there's all sorts of, sub-trajectories in this topic beyond just the exegetical issues of the passage. There's a lot to think about here. The arguments that people try to make, and I'm quite familiar with the teetotaler argument because my first context as a believer was fundamentalism. But to be honest with you, the arguments that are made on behalf of that view are really weak. The important, issue, of course, the important line not to cross is drunkenness. But again, like you say, how do we define that? Well, I would personally, and just on a personal note here, I don't drink alcohol at all. This will shock some listeners, but I have never tasted beer. I can't even stand the smell of it. Part of the reason is probably because I grew up in an alcoholic home. I didn't need a preacher to tell me to not do that. I've never had any sort of desire or inclination for it. I just don't do it. My wife, will have, some wine or something. I don't extrapolate from my predilection, over to everybody else, under my roof. But again, backtracking to the subject, one of the things that if I were having this discussion with somebody who was living, in my house, I would say, hey, you need to consider 1 Corinthians 6:12. When you're talking about how do we know, we might sort of be getting to this line that it is admittedly, not perfectly easy, to define, but this is the passage where Paul says, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. And he's basically saying, I'm not going to be under the control of anything. Okay, I want to be in control of my faculties, who I am, what I'm doing, what I'm thinking, all this kind of stuff. And so I think that's actually a good touch point to help maybe define, at least, in practice, try to define, what's meant, what we mean by buzzed condition, like you described. Well, do you really have control over what is beginning to affect your vision, your thinking, all this kind of stuff. So I think that's a worthwhile thing to sort of loop into the discussion. I think the same thing applies to drugs, though I think the ancient association of drugs with demonic presence and demonic solicitation would have made the drug issue sort of more of an issue in antiquity. But even that really, goes to intent. And I'll try to unpack that real quickly. So basically, the drugs were more powerful, or maybe it would get you more quickly to an altered state of consciousness, whose effects would include visionary experiences, leading people to believe they were contacting spiritual presences, and hence the sinister association in antiquity between drug use and the spirit world. Plant-based drugs are among the prohibited practices with respect to what English translations loosely call sorcery. There are lemmas that specifically target plant-based drugs. Again, the context of those things is solicitation. It's divination. It's trying to contact the other side, to get information or contact the dead or whatever. And so these things that would produce altered states of consciousness were thought to assist that process, and hence they get condemned. So, if you go to Deuteronomy 18:10, 10 and 11, let me just go there and read it quickly because I don't want to garble it here. There shall not be found among you anyone who burns his son or his daughter as an offering, anyone who practices divination or tells fortunes or interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or a charmer, or a medium, or a necromancer, or one who inquires of the dead. Now, for our discussion purposes, the two Hebrew terms that are underneath sorcerer and charmer are the issue. Now, I'm going to read you a little real quick section here from Ann Jeffers' book, Magic and Divination in Ancient Palestine and Syria. This is a 1996 work put out by Brill. I don't know that it's in print anymore, and if it is, it's going to be a few $100s. But this is the major study on magic and divination. So she writes, this term, and she's talking about the first one here, the one that's translated sorcerer, which is mekasef, or the lemma is kasaf. This term is most frequently translated sorcery, but comparative terminology in other Semitic languages points us in the direction of one who concocts potions from plants or an herbalist. Scholars generally agree that the root, for the second one, which is kavar, refers to the use of charms and spells, since the root conveys the idea of uniting, joining, and weaving. Kavar is a lemma that means to join, to put together. Which may be, back to Jeffers, which may by extension speak of the practice of tying or wrapping magical knots or threads around people or objects, or again, to put ingredients together, again, to create these charms, again, whatever they are. So you have a few things there, and you say, what if I'm an herbalist? Good grief, I grow herbs in my backyard. I need to repent. Now, again, consider the context. The context is divination. And the reason that it gets the association is, again, producing altered states to, experience the spiritual world. That kind of thing is condemned. So, again, I don't know. I can read, what the effects of this or that drug are. But I guess I would question the wisdom. We do have wisdom texts in the Bible. This is why we have them. Wisdom texts are not flat out do's and don'ts. They are flat out, well, if you do this, it might be really stupid. And if you don't do that, it might be unwise. This is the sort of thing that you have to consider. Why would you fiddle with it? Why would you fiddle with it? I do know because of my home. I not only grew up in an alcoholic household, but I had at least one stepbrother who was really into drugs. When my dad did get sober, which happened when we were in junior high, and he never touched, alcohol, up to then, to his death, a couple of years ago. But we had a steady stream. My dad had a real soft spot for people who were in this, who were addicted. And so he had a construction business that I worked for 3 years, and we had a steady stream of people from jail, people from halfway houses, people from AA come through. He would give them jobs. And, sad to say, most of them never made it, and they would tell you. They would tell us, the kids that, my dad's kids, don't do pot. That's where I started. I must have heard that 100 times, and okay, dude, you're the one that's addicted. So I guess I'll consider you an authority, So, it just, why do we want to experiment with this stuff? I just don't get it. I don't see how it's wise. Okay, that's a key thought. Wisdom. If all you're concerned about is the black and white do's and don'ts, frankly, that's unwise. All right, wisdom material, just wisdom living in general, isn't equatable with just the strict do's and don'ts. It's make good decisions. Is this a good decision? So again, my own personal experience, even though I've never done this stuff, I've probably seen a lifetime or two of it. Again, not direct experience, but just seeing how it destroys people. So I would just question again, how is this wise? In the New Testament, you get Galatians 5:20, pharmakeia. Again, this is also equated with sorcery. Paul mentions, he actually uses this word a couple times. Galatians 5:20 is one. It's in a list of vices. Sorcery. I'm going to read a little bit here since I want to give the New Testament fair time here. This is from Moo's commentary on Galatians. Sorcery translates the word pharmakeia, whose similarity to our English pharmacy reveals its basic meaning of dispensing drugs for medicinal purposes. In the Greek of our literature, however, New Testament era, it has a negative sense, referring either to the administration of poison, and he cites something from Josephus, or to the use of drugs in magical practices, and by extension to those practices themselves. The word is used of the, quote, secret arts of the Egyptian magicians in the Septuagint, Exodus 7:11, 22, chapter 8, 3 and 14, so on and so forth. So he has a bunch of cross-references here. So again, it has this association, but that doesn't mean if you're a pharmacist, you need to repent. Okay, these things, these statements, these ideas are in the context of divination and, idolatry, soliciting the other side, so on and so forth. So we have to consider that context for them, which really, in my head, takes us to wisdom living. And again, my question would be is, how is this wise? Explain that to me. And wise doesn't mean, well, I just want to try it. Again, I'll repeat the question. How is this wise? I didn't ask you, how is it pleasurable? I asked you, how is it wise? Totally different question.
Mike, I've never had beer either.
Right.
I tell you, I've had some unwise moments in my college days. So
I'm sure you have. I know lots of people who have.
Texas Tech.
Shut up.
We'll move on from that. But Tim,
I'll let you edit that out and extricate yourselves.
No, I'll leave it in there. I'm all right. I'm all right. I'm all right. There's nothing wrong with that. I own my mistakes. That's how you
there
learn.
You go.
You got to make mistakes in order to learn. So
that's good. Yep. And I watched lots of people make lots of mistakes.
Yeah. And hopefully
some of them ended very badly.
Yeah. And hopefully you can learn from those mistakes. So